Welcome to this afternoon session with Adam Strom. Adam Strom.
International Conference on Thinking.
Please welcome Adam Strom.
She's not allowed to say, like, what a man. That's like really embarrassing. So, I used to teach a million years ago in Santa Monica, California, and I had 11 students. This is not like the classroom of 11 students. It was this class teaching severely emotionally disturbed kids. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk about reimagining migration in schools and society. I've been in Facing History and Ourselves for about 22 years, but I've been a groupie of my colleagues for a very long time. So I don't know how many of you know, actually you probably know one of my colleagues because she was here earlier this week. You know Veronica Vencia. I don't know how many of you were in the room when Veronica was here earlier this week. Good. So, and I also want to do a shout out to Carola and Marcelo Suarez Orozco, who are my partners at UCLA. They've done deep thinking about immigrants, education, and youth for a very, very long time. I kind of come back at this from actually really thinking about how is it that human beings respond to difference. So that's my entry point into this conversation. So I'm gonna play with some ideas that are in formation. We have just began a new organization called Reimagining Migration. And what we're really looking to do is to try to create schools where, and learning spaces really, where people inside and outside of school recognize the important role that migration has played in human history, and maybe can help start to build warmer, welcoming, more inclusive communities. So, and y'all, this is participatory, and I'm just going to call on you. So maybe not individually, but collectively. So, as humans, as a species, I'm just interested, what do you think that we share across our 7 billion people on this planet? What do we share? Our basic needs? Somebody else? Our stories? Our life cycle, aspirations? The planet? Great. I would argue that a lot of these ideas are deeply informed by our experiences of migration. This is actually, I've been thinking a lot about, like, what have human families actually done that we can all somewhere back in our lineages say, yeah, we did that. And I would say we all moved somewhere, right? It may not have been a big leap, but sometimes it's a much bigger leap than we think. I'm going to start with a short video that frames a question. I'm going to explore some stuff for a little bit. I'm going to make y'all talk to each other for a long time. And then I'm going to come back and clean the conversation up a little bit. So that's where we're going. So let's see this. US-centric. But that story is a story everywhere. People, I'll get into some numbers later. But migration, which we used to think of as happening, between one country and another. If you look at maps of global migratory patterns, this is global. And some of the places that you might least expect it are actually housing the greatest number of migrants around the world. And what you see, unfortunately, you see a huge range of behavior, right? From unbelievable gestures of welcoming. Some of the stories we were talking earlier about some of the stories about Greek fishermen responding to the refugee crisis on the boats, welcoming people in. But we also see that nasty and hostile rhetoric towards newcomers. That is also part of the experience of migration. If we were to step back, it's this anti-immigrant rhetoric and stereotypes and myths about newcomers are really dangerous to democracy. We've seen how these get exploited again and again and again. And that's not a partisan message. These are sort of the patterns of our stories. So this is a piece by Banksy. I don't know how many of you know Banksy, with birds. It is, migrants not welcome, go back to Africa, keep off our worms. It's sort of a joke, but it's sort of not. So this is a turtle, obviously. So in 2007, Robert Putnam was looking at the way that communities responded to recent diversity, recent integration. And what Robert Putnam found, he's a political scientist at Harvard, maybe most famous for his book Bowling Alone, which is about people kind of retreating away from civil space. He found that with increased diversity, he said people turtled. They went back into their own shell. People had less friends. People were out in public less. You know what went up? Political marches and television watching. That was not meant to be an anti-immigrant message. It was saying that this seems to be part of the process. So we have to think a lot about how that receiving society influences the lives of the newcomers. Right? What does it mean when people retrench and give up civil space? So my colleagues Marcelo and Carola Suarez Orozco did a study starting in 2012 where they studied immigrant kids from a number of groups. They were looking at folks in Northern California and in the Boston area where I'm from. And they asked a very, very simple question. Most Americans think that, and then kids were to fill in the blank. So, what do you think? Were these stories going to be positive stories or negative? The most common answer, 65% of the young people that answered, most Americans think that, answered negatively. For some groups it was even higher. For Latinos in the US, about 75%. For some Latino groups, actually Dominicans, it was 82%. Haitians, 82%. So I'll just give you some of the quotations. Most Americans think that we can't do the same things as them in school, at work. Said a 10-year-old Mexican girl. We don't exist, 12-year-old Mexican boy. We're stupid, a 10-year-old Haitian girl. We're useless, a 14-year-old Dominican girl. We are garbage, a 14-year-old Dominican boy. We are members of gangs, a 9-year-old Central American girl. Most Americans think that we are lazy gangsters, drug addicts that only come to take their jobs away. A 14-year-old Mexican boy. These kids are reading what's in the society. They're internalizing the messages from the outside world. So there was a really good study done by John Rogers and a lot of people at the UCLA Institute. I have to read the footnote on this because I forget John Center's name. The UCLA Institute for Democracy and Education. It was about classrooms after the election in the United States. And the big picture is finding that kids across the spectrum are taking in the political environment, which has gotten very deeply polarized in the United States. Kids are taking it in, and it's affecting their social and emotional sense of well-being and their academic performance. And that's not just kids who are newcomers. Those are kids in the dominant society as well. As a matter of fact, some of the schools that actually had the deepest tensions were schools that were actually integrated, where there was actually a diversity of kids. So as we start to think about creating a society, that is ready for the future, right? What does it mean that our young people are internalizing these stories? In particular, sometimes people say, this is just about the immigrant kids and let's focus on them. And as a matter of fact, if you go to most schools, the immigrant kids are kind of isolated out on the side, and the EL teacher, the people teaches them a foreign language because the people responsible for them. And everybody else kind of goes to exist somewhere else. But actually what the Rogers studies find is something really challenging. That actually a lot of the kids in the dominant culture, the broader culture, some of these kids are, and I'm using language carefully here, some of these kids are trying on bigotry. Trying on this political language. We don't know how committed to it, but they're trying it on. And other kids are witnessing what's happening to their peers. Right? Perpetrators and bystanders, witnesses, and think about how they're going to respond to this changing environment. So how do we make sense of this when we think about our world's history? Actually, for human beings, we have been on the move. We've just confirmed this with a recent archaeological finding. We've been on the move for about 170,000 years. We know this for our science, right? We know this, paleontologists will tell you that this is part of the record. We know this through our genes, through our genetic pattern. We know this in our history. We know it in our literature. We know it in our religion. This is what we do. So I'm going to tell you a personal story that's a little fragile. My father was a geneticist and an immunologist. He passed away in December. He was a giant actually in the field of immunogenetics. And my dad and I always joked, right? He always thought about himself as this tough Jewish kid from the south side of Chicago. That's how he carried himself. A lot of his collaborators were from around the world. And so one of his friends was a doctor from India said, Terry, go do Ancestry.com. You work with all these population geneticists at National Geographic. Go trace your ancestry. So this tough kid from the south side of Chicago who thought all of his family were these Eastern European Jews found out he had this other layer of his ancestry. It says a lot about our own patterns of migration. Turns out he was Punjabi, at least at some point. Science is giving us an opportunity to rethink these stories of our own histories. Right? It's a reminder. What we think of as our identities sometimes are just the tip of the iceberg of much, much longer stories. So I have really good friends from the Punjab, and I always say, I can prove my family's from Punjab. Can you guys prove it? Like, yes, of course, we flew here. So this is part of our religious stories, right? This is from a protest after what some people have talked about as the immigration ban last January. People are using religious narratives as a reminder of these larger connections of human beings. Jesus was a refugee. Muhammad was a refugee. Moses was a refugee. These are our shared stories, actually, stories of migration. It's in our books. The United States, our past, our present, our future, is entirely a story of migration, both forced migration. I've taken this as an image of a slave ship posed on the Mayflower because the U.S. has this dual narrative, a dual narrative of forced migration and migration by choice, right? Immigration or forced migration. But that's the history of this country. It's not so dissimilar to the history of other places in other parts of the world. Y'all with me? All right. So I'm using the U.S. as an example to speak from, but I'm hoping that if y'all are not from the United States, you're thinking about how this story works in your own country's history. So there's myths and realities of migration. So I'll just pick on my own family. So our family came in 1907. And like a lot of families that came at that time, we think, oh, we came to the United States, and then we kind of became successful and integrated. But that's actually not the truth. You have to look deeper at these stories of migration. It's come out in the last couple of weeks. People have been in the political rhetoric around whether people have to come here and they have to be speaking English and whether they have to have job skills. Actually, when you look at stories of migration and histories of migration, in long periods of struggles and adjustment and integration. They're not necessarily a positive trajectory because so much of that story is influenced by the culture in which people land. So I was, a project I worked on this year, I was reading the Big Debrief. This is, if you don't know it, you should read it. The Big Debrief are letters written to a Jewish newspaper at the turn of the 20th century in New York. They were the first Dear Abby column. Do you guys know what Dear Abby is, or is that an old reference? You know, it's an advice column. And they're all stories of integration. As a matter of fact, the editor of the paper, his name was Abraham Kahani, created the column to help people integrate. So I was reading the letters, and what you find is that these are today's stories in 19th and early 20th century language. So this is a letter from 1933. It's these Jewish kids, and they're complaining about their parents. They're like, God, when we bring our friends home, our parents speak Yiddish in front of us. It's so incredibly embarrassing. In front of Christians, they do this. How dare they? So the editor wrote back, he said, we see absolutely no crime in parents speaking Yiddish to their sons. The language is dear to them, and they want to speak that language to their children and all who understand it. It may also be that they're ashamed to speak their imperfect English among strangers, so they prefer to use their mother tongue. Is that story familiar to people? If people heard stories like that in their own family or in their students' family story? Raise your hand if you. It's amazing what you get from a 20th century, you know, this is like an old newspaper, the archives are almost destroyed. But what you read in these letters are the stories about women who are feeling like they want to be educated and yet their husbands aren't letting them out of the house to learn English. You're learning stories about people being discriminated against at work. Learning stories about people who are trying to balance between their old tradition and living in a society where the newcomer, where their identities are in the minority. This is the texture of our stories. So I thought I would show you just a demographic story for the United States just quickly. So on the far end is looking at both the raw number of immigrants, which is in blue, and the percentage of immigrants, which is in orange. If you just follow the United States going from about 1850 in 2020. A lot of people are very concerned right now. They say, oh my God, the number of immigrants is so high. Interestingly, that if you look at a raw percentage, the percentage of immigrants right now is actually lower than at the peak at the turn of the 20th century. About 13.1% right now. It was 14% in about 1907. So, but you know, the numbers spike. But actually, if you look at that orange line, it doesn't change all that much, right? Migration is a constant. This is part of our human history, despite the fact that in the middle of that period, there was the 1924 Immigration Act, which made getting to the United States quite difficult. So currently, there are 1 billion people on the move. That's about 250 million people living in the countries outside of where they're born, and about 750 million more migrants who are moving internally, whether it's, you know, from countrysides into cities in Asia or moving because of climate issues, right? 1 billion people on the move. And what you're looking at is people moving from continent to continent, right? So the blues are Europe to Europe, Asia to Asia, Africa to Africa. So it's not just that the US isn't any exceptional. This is a global phenomenon. I thought this was interesting. This is a percentage of foreign-born population in different countries around the world, just to give you a perspective. If you notice, the US is at 13.1%. France is about 12%. UK's 12.3%. Germany's about 12.8%. Canada, 20%. Australia, 28%. Qatar, 75% better. And then United Arab Emirates at about 88%. The global perspective is interesting. It's seeing your own story from somebody else's lens and somebody else's perspective. So there is also 65.6 million displaced people in the world right now. You probably have heard this, but it's worth saying again. That is the greatest number of displaced people in the world since the end of the Second World War. And it was at that time that we started drawing up international conventions about the rights of refugees, human rights, the rights of newcomers. So last year, there were 31.1 million new internal displacements, violence, climate change. That's one person forced to flee every second. Migration is happening all the time, everywhere, forever. And we go back and forth between these beautiful stories of welcoming and deep prejudice. So there's, on the left is a sign there, it's newspaper advertisements from my home city of Boston. On the Irish, don't bother applying for any jobs here. We don't want you. On the right is now a national treasure document, which is a US Census, which says that Annie Moore, an Irish immigrant, was the first immigrant to come to the US through Ellis Island. And everybody's very proud of Annie Moore. Just in those 40, 50 years. It's back and forth. Anti-immigrant media and migration, both in traditional forms of media and in memes. I've shown you that UC refugees, that's an internet meme. It may feel like this is just spreading everywhere, but it's been around for a really, really, really long time. And often the same sorts of images, you know. The hordes are coming at us and we're backing off and we're gonna lose everything. I thought I would share this poem that was scratched into the walls of Angel Island. Angel Island is where most Chinese immigrants tried to come into the United States. It's built after 1910, in the years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. I wish there was a mic back there because you don't want me to read it, but I'll do it anyway. Instead of remaining a citizen of China, I willingly became an ox. I intended to come to America to earn a living. The Western-style buildings are lofty, but I have not the luck to live in them. How was anyone to know that my dwelling place would be a prison? There's the newcomers come from China, the laws had changed, and these folks were stuck on Angel Island. So skepticism towards newcomers is predictable. We actually know this. I actually think it'd be really interesting if our young people knew this, and if all of us knew this. So as we're experiencing what we experience right now, we might say, hey, you know what? We've done this before. In the classrooms in the US, and again, globally, these numbers are on the rise too. 26% of the kids in the classrooms in the US are of immigrant origin. Places like Miami, Boston, big cities, much, much higher numbers. But 26%, when I say immigrant origin, I mean immigrants or the children of immigrants. And it's not going to change all that much. There are places, I think you might agree, where this is spiking dramatically right now. But migration, these periods of mass refugee movement, are actually sort of the exception. But migration itself is sort of the rule. I'd just like you to take a look.
Valuable.
Actually, back up. So what I want us to do is start to move from these stories in the abstract to think about our stories in the particular, in our own stories. So I'm going to make you all talk to each other in a second. So one of the projects that we've started is this project called Moving Stories. And it's really trying to encourage people to talk and listen to each other's stories. We've created I don't want to sound like a product salesman, but we've created a migration storytelling app that's free. If you go to Moving Stories on the Google Store or the Google Play or the Apple Store, it's free. We're going to do kind of a paper version of this in a second. Here's a little bit of the background.
Valuable.
Lazy, out of place.
Family, undocumented.
There is a story behind every decision to migrate. A story that is both universal and deeply personal.
What did your family hope for in their new life here?
Well, I feel like they were just hoping for a better chance at life.
Other than Indigenous people in this country, everyone else has migrated at some point.
Some people, like me, are a mix of everything because that's what we are. We are a nation of immigrants.
Our stories are the stories that make up the fabric of the United States.
Okay, your turn. So there's a lot of questions up there because I wanted to give you choice. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to turn to somebody Actually, usually I would say turn to somebody that you don't know. But my sense is you probably don't know these stories about each other. So I want you to choose one of these questions, and I want you to ask that question to somebody, and then I want you to listen to their answer. I'm going to give you 12 minutes. I know you're not doing your job if this room doesn't get really loud. Go. I wish you all had mics because A, I wish I would have loved to have heard all those stories. But since everybody's here, there's so many Project Zero people, I'll just steal Project Zero idea. And I'd like to use an exercise that Project Zero has done, which is the 3 whys. So I want to start thinking about significance. So why are these stories important to you personally? Just shout, like get really loud. It's your identity, part of your identity, part of your values. It's part of your sense of belonging on a personal level. I'm sorry, say that again. It builds character, it's part of your own story that it's, it's our myth, right? That helps us build our sense of ourselves. Why do you think, I want to shift a little. Why are these stories, and I'm using this expression, your community, open, but why are these stories important to your community, however you define them? Because it's emotional investment in this community. What else? It stretches the boundaries. Explain that a little more. That's really an important point. So every time somebody new comes, those boundaries have to stretch a little bit. And what's the relationship between that, sticking with you for a sec, and then in these stories? Conversation, it's dialogue. Great. Other people, why are these stories important to your community? Yeah. You learn from each other. Teaches tolerance. Yeah, right? I mean, we're listening here. To me, one of the things that's really interesting is I describe this as a storytelling project, but it's really a listening project. Right? Actually, if you download the app that we built, it doesn't ask you to tell your story, it asks you to go to interview somebody else. Right? Because the key job is to listen and hear somebody else's experience and then exchange ideas and reflect back on them. And then just to close the loop, why do these stories matter to the world? We share these same qualities. We share the same world. It's what we have in common. Yeah, it lets you explore these issues through time, right? One of my favorite moments working on this was, do people have some idea of Boston? Boston, I love Boston, but it's also a pretty segregated city. And so I did a workshop with some teachers in Boston, and this woman was 5th generation Irish American. And she really didn't want to do this. And then she got paired up with a woman from Puerto Rico who had come like in the last year. And at the end of it, they both grabbed me on the arm and they're like, oh my God, we have so much in common. Thank you, thank you. And I was like, all I did is give you an occasion to talk. That's all this is about, is finding a moment to talk and listen. So I believe that this is a starting point for a bigger, deeper exploration. But it's about building investment. And it's empathy is an overused word right now, very, very overused word. But it's in listening to each other that we may find those connections. Call it empathy if you want to, which I probably wouldn't, but other people would. So the other thing you'll find as we start to tell these stories, realize that these stories all have common elements. There's a story about life before migration. There's the journey of migration itself. There's the shock of transplantation. Carola Suarez Orozco, she's a gardener. She talks about how, when you move a plant, have you ever moved a plant and it looks like it's going to die right away? And then actually, eventually, often, it comes to life, but it depends on what that soil is like. So that transplantation shock, and then to steal a frame from Yuri Bronfenbrenner, The Ecology of Adjustment, Life in the New Place. If you start thinking about those core parts of the journey, there's opportunities to compare and contrast. When are things done by choice? When are things forced upon people? What was the reception like at different time periods? What was that journey like? Think about, I mentioned the Irish before. The Irish talk about coming to the United States in coffin ships, right? My family came at a time when people remember coming in steerage and having folks in the first class drop orange peels at them and felt very insulted by that, and some people probably thought they were giving the poorer people nutrients. And of course, in some ways, that's a privileged journey compared to the stories of Africans who were forcibly migrated to the United States as part of the experience of slavery. So in those comparisons and contrasts, I think we start to learn something about the world, and we learn something about our community today. So as a society, how are we prepared to start to think about these dilemmas that come up through the stories of migration? And this is where I'm thinking big picture about frameworks for thinking about migration. Back, some questions we might be exploring. So why do people migrate? These are simple questions, but deeply important. What factors influence how communities respond to migration? Why is sometimes the community really welcoming? And why do sometimes they turn people away? There's an artist named Shimon Atti, who is, he's from Brooklyn. I'd be afraid that he was in Brooklyn. And he did a really powerful piece in Copenhagen, a city that's very proud of taking in Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. And so he under the harbor, he showed stories of people who took in Jews fleeing the Holocaust. But then he showed images of Bosnian Muslims who were turned away from that very same city. Why was one community welcomed at one time, and why was another community not welcomed at another time? How does migration impact both migrants, but the receiving community, right? How do those societies negotiate change? We need to step back and explore these questions. Again, to repeat something I said earlier, you don't just arrive and become part of a new community. This happens over time. It's a dialogue. People sometimes forget the word integration is defined as a two-way process. Assimilation in English is a one-way process. Integration is supposed to be societies coming together. Well, this is a deep philosophical question and really important, actually. How can we negotiate multiple belongings? In other words, can I be Jewish and American, or does that mean I have some loyalty to somewhere else? When Napoleon became emperor, he actually brought the heads of the French Jewish community together and he said to them, are you more loyal to Jews, or are you more loyal to France? And they had to think about how best to answer that without trying to say that their other brethren don't matter. But how do you negotiate those multiple identities? All of us have them, and it's a good thing. But sometimes that's perceived as being disloyal. So despite this rapid growth of immigrant communities around the world, most adults that serve immigrant origin youth are failed. It's not part of our preparation to deal with the particular needs of these communities or the particular needs of communities that are changing as a part of migration. It's not an insult. I'll tell you that we did a study of teacher ed journals. Out of like 3,900 plus articles, 13 of them were about immigration. It's just not part of the way that educators are prepared, never mind the rest of adults in society. So what are the civic skills? What's the knowledge and academic skills? What are the social emotional competencies that we need to develop for a world of migration? It's not something that I think we should have a flip answer to. What we're working at Reimagining Migration doing is creating a framework to help us think about these issues and to think about what's a developmentally appropriate age to raise these questions at different levels of people. So this first step is going to be really working on creating a research-based framework to think about this stuff. So we're really interested in people who want to pilot some of these ideas with us. And if that's something y'all are interested in, I'll give you my email. But the idea is once we have this framework, we really want to empower educators to do this work, understanding that this is not just about a classroom, but it's about whole educational learning communities. And then we're really trying to put together a network of networks that will be growing and learning from each other. And hopefully we can start to build a movement to say, look, this is about how do we create welcoming 21st century communities. So what are some of the, it's early, so we're being careful about putting our stake in the ground. But what are some of the skills, competencies that we want students to be able to walk away with? We want young people and adults to be able to walk away with the ability to inquire and maybe the disposition to inquire about migration instead of assume that they know the story, right? And learn about all the complexities of these different stories, reason with it, draw from evidence, understand these stories. We want people to be able to take perspective. This is really important, and you start to do that when you start to share stories. You start to understand how when we look at migration, we're looking at it with our own story in mind, but how do we open up when we hear another story and put them side by side? And it's okay that we have our own perspective and we have our own bias. We need to not only take perspective, but recognize where we're coming from in these conversations. It's a way to have a more civil dialogue instead of saying, my folks came and we did this. It's not really healthy. We've got to find a way where we hear somebody else's story. And we recognize some of the inequities in these stories of migration. Not every migration story is the same. I pointed out, right, there's stories of migration for choice. There's folks who've come for economic reasons. There's some folks who came from opportunities who had a lot of money. I've been doing a lot of work on migration, as you can tell, for the last couple of years, and among my best friends, probably like y'all, I've met many newcomers, and one of my friends said, "Don't pity us. We came here, we're doing pretty well, right?" So there are different stories in everybody's condition. So do we understand the power and disparities associated with these stories of migration? They're not all on the same level. How do we learn to build relations across difference? There's all kinds of evidence that this is incredibly important for creating productive workplaces, productive communities, where we're able to talk about issues so they don't just simmer and fester. How do we learn to be able to take action based on what we learned, right? And to start to strengthen civic life, democratic institutions. I've told you, and I'm not being flippant when I tell you, that anti-immigrant dogma has been used again and again to disrupt democracy. So these are the kids in our classrooms. Right? This is the growing diversity is part of something that we should be excited about. In schools, there's this language around deficit. Right? If people think about folks who are missing something, how do we start to recognize newcomers bringing incredible stories, incredible histories that will ultimately, in the long run, enrich our community? We may turtle in, to go back to Robert Putnam at the beginning. It doesn't mean that that's where we end. So you'll look and you'll listen. You'll find these debates coming again and again around a number of issues. And I think it's really important that people learn, have frameworks for talking about them. So I found a website full of icons. So I fell in love with icons. But you listen to the language. There are all kinds of debates about language. Newcomers come in and they have to speak the dominant language of society. I have a good friend who's a professor in Germany who's done a lot of work on immigrant education, and they're really battling. The kids have to only speak German in their classrooms. She was shocked when I took her to a class in LA where the teacher was speaking in English, and then when the kids did small group work, they spoke in Spanish. And then they spoke in English again when they came back to the larger group. Wait, you can't do that. I would get in so much trouble in Germany if I did that. That language becomes hot button issues. The law, right? Stories of law become hot button issues again and again, right? What are the patterns that we set for normal behaviors of the community? We battle over education. What do we learn? What stories do we learn? We battle over religion, prayer and culture and custom. I have a friend who studies mosque debates in Europe. He argues that actually these are really worth talking about. In these discussions and these dilemmas that communities have, That's how societies are working out the kind of community they want to be in the long run. We battle over borders, who's allowed to come in and who's not. We battle over loyalty. How do you best show your loyalty? We battle over community symbols. Now we remember them. These are the most important challenge. Not the most important, I'll be a little more humble. They are among the most difficult civic issues that we're going to face over the next centuries. People are coming now with stories of acculturation, belonging, have a long arc. They have a long arc. So there's all kinds of themes that start to come up. For the most part, this is not stuff that we teach about. It's not stuff that we've actually learned to talk about as communities very well. Whether it's, when I start talking about genetics of migration, people freak out. Say, oh my goodness, you're talking about eugenics. Like, we haven't learned to have civil conversations about some of these basic issues. How do we talk about refugees and belonging? How do we talk about our histories without people feeling like they're stepping on one tradition over the other? So how do we prepare people to think when you're looking at any of these debates? What's the question? What are the arguments that you're hearing on the surface? But then what's underneath it all? And if we can't figure out how to do this civilly, it's going to be a rough couple of years. I won't actually, this is not part of my slide. This is data I keep for myself. I'll tell you, since I shared it, I'll show you why, I'll tell you the reason why I do it. People again and again, one of the things you keep hearing is, well, today's immigrants don't integrate. It's amazing that again and again, study after study after study proves that immigrants are actually integrating, at least in the US, faster than they ever have before. But I can tell you that 30 times. The person who wrote this piece that I'm basing at, Mary Waters, has done more interviews. And people are always like, are you sure? That can't be true. It's because our biases get in the way of our ability to take in that evidence. So I didn't mean to go to that slide, pretend I ended this way. Thank you so much.